second while I get technology plugged in. My name is Mickey, and I'm a designer. I'm a product designer. Let's see if we can turn this all on. Probably everybody knows what a product designer is. Does everybody know what a product designer is? What would be like a way to define a designer? Anybody have a definition of a product designer or an industrial designer? What do you got?
Creating the specifications for an object based on a certain set of criteria.
Whoa, all right. I should have learned that in school. So yeah, you know, if you look around, the chairs you're sitting on were designed by a product designer. The clothes you're wearing, the car you might have come in, the shoes, the table, the marker. Industrial design kind of came about in the 20th century, early 20th century, with a French designer was one of the early people, Raymond Loewy, in the 1930s and 40s, and he started saying, what would happen if we could find this beautiful zone between the most advanced technology, yet acceptable for normal people? And he called it the Maya zone, most advanced yet acceptable. In the 1930s, he started up a design studio in New York to try to kind of invent our way out of the Depression. And he looked at things that if you made one thing, then it was art. If you made a few things, it was craft. But if you had to industrially produce a lot of things, you had to not only understand what you just said, the specifications, but also the human factors, how does it fit the person, and how do you get it manufactured? And so you end up learning about all sorts of things about not just making a thing, but how would you make 100 things? And how would you make it so that it could be taken back apart again too, put back together? And how would you make it desirable? So anyway, I just fell in love with design when I learned about it in university. And I spent my life doing that, and I worked at a place called Maya that stole that name shamelessly from Raymond Loewy, that came out of Carnegie Mellon about 30 years ago. And I was just in this beautiful design science lab for a long time, and I learned a lot. And it turns out, I'll start this just with this background, it's actually kind of hard to design different things. Maybe designers won't tell you this secret, but it's really easy to design a lot of the same thing. But it's really hard to design something new or different. And because we have all these kind of fixed things that we think about. And I'll give you a sense of that. Let's say that you're given a challenge, like design a cook stove for Burning Man. So you work at a camping company, you stamp a lot of pieces of metal to build kind of these little camping cook stoves and stuff like that. So you have a manufacturing process, maybe you injection mold some things to make a lunch. And you embark on your journey. So here's how it starts. You think you've got kind of a pretty good view of the whole space. You think you're not biased in any way. You're like, I'm going to take this on as a brand new project, and I'm going to design the best cook stove ever for Burning Man. What are the specifications and goals for that? Well, it turns out you're not supposed to leave anything behind at Burning Man. You shouldn't leave any garbage behind. And you have to lug everything in. You have to bring it all to this high desert. And it'd be great if it were efficient and didn't like create pollution and things like that. So there are some goals. I'm a designer, so I've had some wisdom and experience. I've just been doing it for a while, so I know how to design cook stoves, things like that. And then I've got some manufacturing method. Our company makes a lot of stampings. That's like slamming pieces of hard metal together to crimp short, small, soft metal. And some injection molding. And I think I enter this space sort of from the top down, and I've got this beautiful view of all the possibilities. I'm going to consider them from scratch. Blank sheet of paper. It's pretty exciting. But what happens is I enter with a path dependency. I kind of come in from the top. And then it turns out I just can't ignore the fact that there are a lot of cook stoves out in the world. So there are a lot of known examples, which kind of fix my brain in a certain way. It kind of makes me think about, when I think of a cook stove, I think of something, I picture something. I've also got search in Google cook stove, and suddenly I'm like loaded up with a bunch of thoughts that weren't mine. And then if you use a 3D computer-aided design program, you've got these object libraries. You can just pick up a cook stove and drop it in, or pick up a burner, or pick up a little fuel tank and drop it in. You don't have to think about what burnerness is. What is the act of burning something to keep you warm, if that's what it is, or to cook something? You don't think about it because it's just lower friction to just grab a hold of something. So you actually end up entering not a perfect space from the top down. You enter from a direction. You have a sort of path dependency. And then as you're doing this, you get this weird thing called functional fixedness that happens. Your brain kind of fixes the function in your head about what these pieces are that you make and how they go together. And I'll give you an example of functional fixedness. It's a kind of bias. This phone is fixed in my head as a communication device. I think of it as a communication device. Now it turns out, if I needed to, I could use it as a hammer. I could use it as a lot of things, but it's fixed in my head in one way. And so it's very hard to unthink about something. And this is called functional fixedness, which means it's really hard for me to think about how to use like the parts I made, if they didn't sell well, to be used for something else. Because they're fixed in my head as those parts. This burner is that burner. I can't think of it as something else. So that really gets in my way. So these biases start to come into play, which are just shortcuts for us. They're like heuristics for us to survive and thrive in the world. We have a pile of shortcuts that kept us alive over 3 billion years. So they're very important things that help us kind of stay alive, make decisions fast, and things like that. So I'm trying to wander into this space, and then the team and I both have this weird thing happen. It's called the Endowment Effect. Has anybody heard of the Endowment Effect? What's the Endowment Effect?
I think that has to do with your feeling that you can figure this out on your own.
It might be. I think so what happens is, let's say you make 5 sketches, and then you make 2 prototypes of 2 of those sketches. Those prototypes, because you invested more energy in them, are endowed with more value than the other sketches. They just are. They just because you put more time into them, they become endowed with this thing. And the team is like, wow, we spent a lot of time on that. And obviously they must be more valuable because we spent time on them. So you do think, well, I'm on my path because I've made a prototype. You also get this weird thing called choice-supported bias. Like all the choices you have made that you're done with seem more scientific after you've done them. So the team is like, yep, that was a good choice. And it's not really based on any kind of rigor, science, statistics, or anything. It just we made that decision. And then there's something called sunk cost bias. Has anybody heard of sunk cost bias? Do you know what sunk cost bias is?
Yeah, it's the inability to take a different time to
Yeah, we put all this time into this, man. Look at all the money we spent on this thing. We've sunk so much cost into this that it's really hard to unwind it. And this happens if you've ever worked at a startup or if you've ever worked at any kind of an organization. It's really hard to let go of those things you created that maybe don't work because you spent so much time on them. So you get the sunk cost bias. So you're actually being kind of narrowed down this path to a set of solutions, and you're missing all these other possibilities. And there could be some really powerful possibilities, like stuff that would actually make this thing burn a lot cleaner, make it actually way more efficient, easier to pour it in there because you got to carry everything in there, lightweight. But you can't necessarily even look at them. So you miss that one, and you miss that one because you're barreling ahead towards this particular decision. I want to talk about one that really gets me. It's called the continued influence effect. Has anybody heard of this one? I just learned about this last year formally. I think it always happened to me, but anybody know what that is? This is a weird one. Now, if we look at the words, continued influence effect, it might give us a hint at it. It's that when we learn a fact in the world, it begins to turn into muscles. We basically get really good at using this fact. Maybe I do a lot of design for metal stamping and injection molding. I have all these muscles over time. I've done it for I get wisdom, and I've got this thing starts influencing my behavior. I've built a lot of muscles around this idea that to me is like the way we make things. It's a fact, it's a reality. So when a new technology comes along, like 3D printing, it's very hard for me to actually be expressive with it. I try to do the same things that I did with stamping or molding with this brand new technology, but the old muscles keep coming into play. They keep on trying to overpower any new learning. So the old fact continues to influence me even if there's a radical change in the world. And this happens in a lot of parts of our lives, not just in design. So I'll give you a really tangible example of the continued influence effect. It's kind of it's an example of something I want to talk about tonight. So our brain is this incredibly rich, lush life. It's a lush ecosystem. And it's filled with all these things that are shortcuts and ways of surviving and ways of making decisions under pressure. ways of coping with complexity. And think of these as all the sort of wonderful animals in that ecosystem. They're just like thriving in this ecosystem. And it's really rich. It's kept us alive for a long time. A lot of these, probably you could find out, squirrels have them too, and so do chimpanzees, and a lot of life, because it's been a sort of 3.5 billion year R&D lab of trying to figure out how to keep going as life. So we've piled up a lot of these really interesting shortcuts. So the one I was talking about is right here, continued influence effect. You guys probably saw that. It's hiding there in that really crazy forest. And I want to give you a really technical example. About a year ago, somebody said, you got to watch this YouTube channel. It's called Smarter Every Day. Has anybody heard of Smarter Every Day? Have you heard of it? Yeah, this is really fun. So this 40-year-old mechanical engineer posts videos where he's trying to just get smarter every day. And he records his journey. He's a pretty sharp guy, so his buddies call him up one day and say, oh, I think we got something for one of your episodes. We built you a bike, and we want you to come over to the shop. So this is the bike. Looks pretty normal. And he looked down at the handlebars, and this is what he saw. Now, can anybody tell me what happens when he turns the handlebars to the right?
They go the wrong way.
They go to left. The wheel goes to left. So they just welded a gear in there. That's all. And he can see the new fact. It's not like it's hidden. It's not like there's some black box. He's looking at the new reality, and he's a mechanical engineer. So he thinks to himself, I can learn how to ride this. No problem. So he's got the film crew there, and he's like, come on, let's do this. What does everybody, I'd like an estimate of how long he thought it would take to ride to the end of the hall here, like just to the end of the room. So how long did he believe it would take him, having never seen this before, to just ride from here to there? 5 minutes? Anybody think longer? About an hour? Anybody think shorter?
Like from here to there.
Yeah, from here to the wall.
Like 2 seconds, maybe a
Huh?
minute or two.
Minute or two, yeah. I mean, come on. He's like putting hands the opposite way. He's like, I can totally do this. What did you say?
2 hours.
So Mary comes in with 2 hours. Anybody have a longer one? I mean, you're feeling like this is pretty easy, right? And you're probably fairly smart. And so let's see what happened. About an hour after him trying to get from here to there and not succeeding in getting more than a meter, he was like, all right, this is crazy. Like, he's tried everything, and he cannot get more than about 2 meters, 1.5 meters before he falls over. And he's like, wait, stop. Before I do anything more, make one for my kid. My kid's been riding a bike for half his life, and he's 6 years old. Okay, great. So then he goes home to the kid, and he says, tomorrow morning, we're going to the park, and we're going to both try to ride this bike. And we're going to film doing it. Well, now we already know 1 hour wasn't enough for him. And if you can ride this bike to the end of the hall, basically this far, but in the park, I will introduce you to a live NASA astronaut. Like a real one, which is a great carrot for pretty much anybody at any age, I think, but for a 6-year-old, pretty good. So kid's like, let's go. They get out there. How long do you think it took for the kid to ride from here to the end of the hall? Like, 10 apart. How long? 10 minutes. Anyone shorter? Anyone longer?
20 seconds.
20 seconds. Yeah, he's only been known how to ride for 3 years. This guy's learned to ride, 35 years ago. Anybody have a shorter one? Shorter than 20 seconds. Did he just get on and go? Anyone have a longer one? 2 weeks. All right, so 2 weeks. Oh, the German does not believe you can just learn. Right. Vigorous engineering. Okay, now, at the end of an hour, the kid could not go more than a meter. So they said, okay, I'm not going to torture the kid, let's come back tomorrow. So then the next day, they came back and again tried, both of them tried. Second day, couldn't get more than a meter. Okay, let's come back the next day. Try again. How long did it take for the kid to learn how to ride from here to there? Estimates. You know it's more than 2 hours.
20 days.
20 days. 20 days. Okay, how long do you think it took for him to learn how to ride the bike from here to there? Doing this every hour. I mean, once a day. He never did. Anybody have another assertion?
72 hours.
72 hours. So the father
The father.
and the son,
48 hours.
72, 40. Oh, okay, so you've got this kind of, you've got some science going on in here. I think you've got some plan.
How about 10,000 hours?
Somebody knows how to read a book. Well done, Bill Mark. So it could be 10,000 hours. Now, we know 10,000 hours of bad practice gives you nothing. But 10,000 hours of good practice actually gives you this crazy collection of muscles, which is actually what that whole book was based on. Malcolm Gladwell's book about sort of really, the Beatles actually weren't overnight sensations. They had 10,000 hours of incredibly good practice, having stuff thrown at them in this bar in Germany, somewhere, in Hamburg. Yeah, before they were an overnight sensation, they had built a lot of muscles. Well, 8 months, and then he could ride not only this far, but around the block and everywhere. 2 weeks. Okay, so our mental model of the continued influence effect is not maybe accurate. Could they still ride a normal bike? Could they? What does everybody think? No? Yes, no? Raise your hand if you think they could jump on a normal bike too.
Yeah, and fall off.
And fall off. Okay, so of course, he's like, that's a good question. They have not been riding normal bikes at all. Only the backward bike. So he sends a note to all of his YouTube followers and he says, I'm going to the capital of all bike riding. Where does he go?
Beijing.
Well, Amsterdam. Probably the real capital would have been somewhere else, but he went to Amsterdam. And he sent out this note, I'm coming to Amsterdam, I'm going to try to ride a normal bike. So the film crew's there, the crowd gets there, and he gets on the bike and he falls off. And he gets on the bike and he falls off. And he gets on the bike and he falls off. And he's talking out loud the whole time. He's doing sort of think aloud, so you can actually hear his mental model. So he's like, okay, okay, I think he could not get more than 2 meters on a normal bike. So he's continuing to do this. How long do you think it took him to ride a normal bike? 8 months. See, so now you're seeing, I saw a number before, I'm going to use this number again. That's called the availability bias, by the way. When you have a number preloaded in your head, it's just more available than another number. Anybody have a different assertion about how long it took for him to ride a normal bike?
3 days.
3 days. It's pretty good. Well, about 19 minutes into him falling off all the time, and talking out loud, he's like, I think, at 19 minutes he says, I think I broke my brain. I mean, imagine, and people are laughing at him, because a grown man not being able to ride a bicycle at this point in Amsterdam is silly. About 20 minutes in, he is pedaling, and he's like, I think I broke it, and then he just rode off. Perfectly fine, it snapped in an instant. And I think if you want to have a better mental model of how this works, I'm going to draw a little picture. So here's the guy, and he learns how to ride a forward bicycle. Back when he was probably 5 years old. And he learns to balance left and right, and then he learns what happens when there's gravel, and he learns how to handle it if somebody's coming at him, and he learns what happens in the rain, and he learns what if he's going downhill, and he builds this deep, deep, deep set of pathways in this jungle to get to riding a bike. So he went from falling a lot to building this set of muscles that really got him to do this, and deeply worn in. He could just ride a bike. And how many people can ride a bike? Pretty good number of you. Well done. Would anybody not raise their hand? How many people can ride a unicycle? See, there's room for growth. All right. So great. Then they introduce this crazy thing called backward bike. Handlebars the wrong way. And he tries to ride it. And he goes, well, I can do this, no problem. And he tries to go down this pathway, and he falls off a cliff. Because there's actually nothing there. There's nothing. There's no pathway in the jungle. There's nothing. He wanders right off and falls off a cliff. So then he tries again the next morning, and he tries again the next morning, and suddenly the brain starts building another little set of pathways that says, actually, the backward bike is the same under rain, and the same with gravel, but it's actually different when it's actually turning left and right. And over the course of time, and he has to sleep in between each one of these. It's this diffuse effect that you have to get when you sleep that actually helps consolidate your muscle memory. He slowly builds basically a switching station. Now, he hasn't actually done forward bike for a while, so this one starts to fade away. The grass starts growing up and it starts to get like a little bit of a less of a beaten path. So when he tried riding a forward bike, he couldn't find a path. He's like, his brain kept on wanting to go down this brand new path. But in a very short period of time, he just kept basically pushing those muscles to go, I know there's a path here. We just have to find it again. It snapped into place. And now he's got a switching station. And if he actually were to practice backward bike, forward bike regularly, he'd be able to ride both. He would have deep neural connections. So that was like an epiphany to me. I was like, wow, okay, our brains are like pretty liquid and malleable. We can do some fun things with them. But what happens when we introduce brand new technologies and we can't think about them in expressive ways? And we think we can. Oh, you just introduced a new cool manufacturing method. I could do that tomorrow. Oh, you just introduced a brand new business model. I could do that tomorrow. Oh, yeah, we got a new way of doing things. It's actually very hard. And that's one of the things that you kind of learn. So I started thinking about this notion of how could we protect this beautiful, rich ecology that we have between our ears? And how can we actually start looking for ways to even amplify that? And maybe even allow us to try out and build muscles and try new practices for new facts in the world, as this world is accelerating and new things are happening. So I started thinking about this kind of in a goofy way. I think of it as, what if we had a cognitive protection agency? What if we had like an EPA for the mind? And the reason I say that, does everybody know what an EPA is? Yeah. So, how many people have heard of the silent spring? Anybody want to tell me what that is?
It's a book by Rachel Carson describing ecological impacts on from the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, so Rachel Carson had worked for decades in the Park Services, and she collected all these actually true stories of industrialists coming in, effectively strip mining natural resources out of the earth, the water, the sky, putting Frankenstein concoctions together that maybe Mother Nature never expected. And then the runoff of all this stuff, they just sort of dumped into the waterways, and they dumped into places they could hide them. Because in their businesses as industrialists, they didn't actually calculate the cost to the world of their business. They just assumed water was infinite. If I dump it in the water, don't worry, it'll wash away. And so she collected all these together into a fable that she called Silent Spring. And this is the original fable. She collected all these true stories, and she wrote a serialized set of articles in the New Yorker. And President Kennedy actually read this. This was back in 1963. And that was actually the beginning of the modern environmental movement. It was, wow, how do we protect these beautiful natural resources? They're not infinite, and if you're not calculating them in the cost of your business, we're in trouble. And so the story basically is there's this lush, beautiful town, and the birds are chirping, the bees are buzzing, the water's flowing, life is good, and then one spring, it falls silent. The bees don't buzz. The birds don't even show up. The fruits don't bloom. That's what this fable is. Now I want you to think a little differently about the brain. Remember I said it was this lush, beautiful, rich ecology? I'm a little worried that the current era of technology has shifted from being interesting for manufacturing things to being actually something that is starting to play with our minds in pretty interesting ways. So imagine one day our brains fall silent. We can't think. We can't pay attention to much of anything. We can't build new muscles because we don't even have the time to think about them. What happens if we do that? So an interesting article came out last year. You sort of wake up in the morning, you're full of energy, the brain is refilled. If you slept well, you meditated, you exercised, your brain actually does slowly regenerate every night, and it's beautiful. But it turns out, just with a phone in your room, even if it's turned off, it starts draining your cognitive capacity. Why do we think that is? Does anybody have an assertion about why, even if the phone is turned off, but it's in the same room, it starts to slowly drain our daily capacity?
You have an unconscious wiring connection to say, if I want some positive pleasure, I'm going to look at my phone, and that during the day you're going to be thinking, do I get that pleasure, do I not?
Yeah, so variable reward, variable time. Has anybody gone to Las Vegas? Who wins in Las Vegas? The house. I mean, if you're a card counter, maybe you can pull this off. But that's variable reward, variable time. I don't know if I'm going to pull that lever, I'm going to get a big reward. I don't know if it's going to happen next time or 5 times from now. So it's and it was probably a great bias when we were hunting mammoths. But it might be past its sell-by date today, and people have learned how to manipulate it. So that's one. The other one is, it's a predator. And we evolved in a world where there were things that could eat us, and things that could hurt us. And so even though it's turned off, it might bite me when it wakes up. And I need to actually dedicate a little bit of my cognitive load to that, and it starts draining that. Because if I turn it on, it might be like a text from my long-lost love. It might be a bill from AT&T. It might be like some horrible disaster happened somewhere, or a loved one died. I don't know, and so my brain has been tuned to look out for danger and predators. So it begins to drain it. And this is the first Internet of Thing device, but it's probably not the last one. It's probably just the beginning of us having stuff surrounding us. So what happens when it's not just a phone, but it's the room, it's the chair, it's the shoes. I think somebody just said that Nike shoes bricked last week. They actually put code on those shoes from the Back to the Future thing that were supposed to close automatically. And all the shoes in the world that had that code bricked, they basically stopped working. Feel bad for Marty McFly. Okay, so you wake up in the morning, you have all this beautiful capacity, and then it starts getting drained. And you get to work, and you don't even have the capacity that you had before. And then there are some people, the new industrialists, who are strip mining your cognition. They're just exactly what Rachel Carson said. They have decided to come up with things that can actually capture your attention. They use something called dark patterns. Dark patterns are design patterns. We know them. As a designer, I learned a lot of tricks to gain people's interest, but also to like have you be more curious or less curious, have you be more competitive or less. You learn these, but they're being used for negative patterns. There's another site called, I think, Evil by Design, and it collects a bunch of those too. So some people have turned these into their business model. The only business model is scrape raw materials, combine them into Frankenstein concoctions, and dump the waste, that's your brain, into a future Superfund site. And that's a little dangerous. That's kind of scary. It was not a big deal when you could control that, but when every single campus in some cities is dedicated to talking directly to your 9-year-old child, it's really hard, right? Because it's hard to get them to stop doing something when literally a campus of supercomputers is targeting them, n equals 1 with equal design patterns. And cognition, all this stuff doesn't happen in a void. It's not like our brains are floating in the ether. This actually happens over time. It happens like maybe over the flow of your team, over the flow of your family, over the flow of your life. It happens in context, because we evolved in context of the real world. And it happens in environments. The environment shapes the way we think. And half of our cognition in many cases is the environment. That's a phenomenon that a cognitive psychologist named Herb Simon discovered, that we actually offload some computation to the physical world. It's a really efficient thing. So I decided to kind of look into this a little bit more, and I wanted to give some examples tonight. Is everybody still with me? I didn't drain your cognition yet? Okay.
Wait, what is it? You offload cognition to the physical world?
That's right, yeah, actually I can explain this one. I'm glad you asked. So Herb Simon, Nobel-winning economist who came up with a theory called satisficing, or bounded rationality, was that we don't actually have the capacity, the sugar, the fluids, the energy in our bloodstream to actually make rational decisions over many things. We would not be alive. We'd be eaten by somebody else because we weren't able to make a decision fast. So what we do is we bound that rationality and we sacrifice and we satisfy. So if you give me 3 options, I actually throw away one of them and I pick from 2 because it's just more economical for my brain. And the way he illustrated this, he said the mind is like, how would we draw this? Yeah, this will work. Pair of scissors. Okay, kind of a crappy pair of scissors, but you get it. And you can't think of a pair of scissors as just one blade. The fun stuff about scissors happens at the emergence, when the 2 blades push against each other. And he said the mind is that way too. There's a part of it that is the brain, that runs all the rules. So if you think of something like an ant, it's got a few rules. It doesn't have a lot of neurons, but one of the rules is like, look for sugar and leave a little trail in the environment.
and keep wandering around and looking for sugar and leave the trail. That's the rule. It runs the rules. But where the heck does all this richness of ants come from? They like maintain 70 degrees inside their ant hills. They fight battles. They farm fungus. They've got like 12 neurons. Well, it turns out some of the computation happens because it's pushing against this interesting thing called the world, the environment. And so it's been able to offload any computation, any algorithms it doesn't need because the environment is stable. We have a really stable contract that was signed right around the time of the Big Bang, around things like physics and things like that. And so at the emergence of the brain running the rules and the environment is where we get this richness and beauty. So we ourselves are not ourselves. We are with each other. Because we offload some of that and we learn from each other and we become, our identity is defined by that. And this was a profound discovery that we've seen a lot of implications for the last maybe 30 or 40 years. So I want to give you some examples. There's this number 180. I just numbered all of them from Wikipedia for fun. And we did this experiment. My intern said, well, we should just go read them all and we should number them. And she was a cognitive psychologist from Israel who knew a lot more about this stuff than I did. And I was like, yes, I will do that. We'll do this. And we start numbering them. Here's an example. There's something called the Law of Triviality. I want you to really have an understanding for this. So the Law of Triviality is, let's say you have to work on a really hard project, like design a nuclear reactor. So the team focuses on designing a nuclear reactor. It's a really hard thing. But what they do instead is they spend all their time talking about the bike shed where the technicians store the bikes to maintain the reactor. In fact, this is called bike shedding, where you just keep averting your eyes from the important hard part because it's hard. And so Parkinson's law of triviality is that we expend almost all of our energy and then we're depleted by the time we have to make the hard decisions or we have to think about those things. And this is particularly pernicious kind of in teams. And sometimes those kind of combine, like if there's ambiguous information, you don't want to attack it because we're not comfortable with ambiguity. So the ambiguity bias comes in. And then you might get some others. You'll get things like the hard-easy effect. Things that are hard you think are easy, things that are easy you think are hard, and you put off certain things because you actually had the wrong model in your head, just like pretty much every person that I've ever asked and every person that's ever tried to ride the backward bicycle has learned the hard way. And there's the base rate fallacy and the sort of ostrich effect comes into play. You could guess what that one is. There's another one that's called the shared information bias. And it doesn't work alone. It actually, it's when you get together as a group, you spend more time sharing information that everybody knows instead of sharing information that is unique to one person. It just feels comfortable. It's sort of social. You want to go, yeah, that thing that happened last week. And you end up spending that instead of talking about the thing that one unique person learned that would really be useful for the project. Unfortunately, that gets coupled with some other things like the authority bias. Does anybody know what the authority bias is? Raise a hand, anybody want to tell us? What's that?
The one in power is always correct?
Yeah, it's just easier. Imagine, it's a dangerous world out there, and the chief says, let's go do this. It's like, I could compute this and spend a lot of time thinking about this, but we might be dead, so I'm just going to do whatever the boss says. So the authority bias is just it's a shortcut. Not necessarily good or bad, it's just a shortcut. It's a way for us to say, well, they've got a good story, I don't have to think that much, right? It tames complexity. So the boss says, let's do it this way, and they do it. Unfortunately, that ties in with some other things, like there's a really weird one called the illusion of mastery, where people who are experts in one thing actually believe they're experts in other things. And so they convince themselves they're masters of something when they're really not. This sometimes happens when you crush for an exam, but you never sleep in between studying, and you sort of feel like you're a master at it, and you maybe could even sustain it for the test. But then when you're actually put on the spot at a real job, you have no idea what the heck you're doing because you never actually built that muscle and you fooled yourself. So that comes into effect. Rosy retrospection is a tricky one. That one comes into effect. The boss starts going, you remember this looks just like that project we did 5 years ago. And they put on rose-colored glasses and they believe something is much easier because they forget all the hard things that happened and they gloss over it because the story is so good. Rosy retroflexion. Okay, I'll give you one last one, and then we're going to have a little fun, I think. So, the law of the instrument. Anybody have an idea what this is? Can we decode what this is, you think? The law of the instrument.
This is actually a really important one too. It's really subtle though. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's just that we're shaped by our tools, because remember, we offload some of our computation to the environment. So if I literally use a hammer for a really long time, my body image actually has this hard thing at the end that I can whack on things. And it really does. It is a way that we grow and learn. So it's really hard to break out of how a tool shapes your thinking. Like when Windows came out, and everybody had BASIC to be able to program Windows, like Visual Basic, you never saw round windows on an operating system. And then Xbox came out, and everything was round, and everything was weird, because the tool was about video gaming. And it was just as powerful, but the tool enabled you to think certain ways. You can think of sort of virtuosos learn how to bend and break tools. They have actually learned the limits of the tools, and they go around the tool, they bend the tool. Think Jimi Hendrix getting a guitar to talk, right? How many people have ever heard Jimi Hendrix? He makes the thing talk. It's not supposed to talk. But he bends and breaks and works around the tool, and it's actually, we don't teach how to actually become virtuosos and how to respect them. People who get the ability to bend and break tools and work in between them. But unfortunately, you get the default effect. People leave all the defaults, and if it's a software tool, it's just easier to use the defaults than actually adjust them. And maybe you never really learned that if you could go a little bit over here, you might get a totally different response. And then you get functional fixedness. We already talked about that. Things are kind of fixed the way they are, so you can't think about them differently. And those pile up with some other things, leveling and sharpening, something called the IKEA effect. I'll leave that to you to study, but a powerful effect. So my intern Netta, the way that I have been working for the last 4 or 5 years is I am an intern. I'm an exit level intern, and I usually have an entry level intern who's my boss. So Netta came in last year and she said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to print all of the biases out, and we're going to actually start annotating them. We're going to start looking to see how they bundle up and what biases get in the way of us getting real projects done. What biases get in the way of us getting something achieved in home life, in work, in a creative project. We try to focus on these creative projects as designers. But we just started annotating them all. So that's what I want everyone to give a try. So the activity we're going to do is I'm at every table. Hopefully there are about 4 people at every table, maybe. If you'd like to come participate, there are blank sheets over here, and you just have to fill a table. You have 2 markers, and you have a bunch of pink Post-it notes. 2 markers at each table, more or less, because we ran out of markers. So share. You could write your name in there if you'd like. There's a little slot for your name. You don't have to. You could make up a name, I don't really care. But the first thing I'd like you to do is write your name in and say hi to everybody who's sitting with you in your little 4-person group. Introduce yourselves. And we're going to pass out some stuff to start this exercise. You have 12 pages at each table. That means you've got 4 people. You could kind of split up the pages. You could look at them together. But what I want you to do, you're going to just do exactly the same thing I did. You're going to just start reading through them. And so as an individual, so not talking at all, everyone at each table is just going to divide up those sheets and start reading through them. And if you hit on one that you think has a big impact maybe on your life, or has a big impact like as a project that you do or you work on, I want you to take a pink Post-it note, and I want you to write the number up in the corner. You can see this one says Rosy Retroaffection, it's number 35. And I wrote a little note underneath it. It says, the past is better. We have a rosy pair of glasses on for the past. So individually, I want you to try to find 3 or 4 ideas, like heuristics, it's a shortcut, it's a bias that you think has a big impact on something you're working on, or that you really think, whoa, that's interesting. And it could even be that you find one and you realize that there's another one there that's almost the opposite. Or it's related, like I just showed you some things that kind of gang up together. But that's your mission for the next about 15 minutes. I want everybody to just start reading through and try to come up with 3 or 4 of these independently. So 1 idea per Post-it. And it's okay, just take your time. This is your time. Start reading through those.
Some are underlined.
Huh?
Some are underlined.
So there are some underlines. That just means that when Netta put that together, she put hyperlinks to the Wikipedia thing. And if anybody'd like this document, I can give it to you, just so you can see it. But the underline doesn't mean pay attention to it more. Hilmar was very good in identifying that. You're looking for patterns, so of course you're going to look for a pattern, and an underline is a pattern. And it would be easier if I understood that the pattern meant something, because that's like authority bias. So somebody else did it for me. Okay, so take your time, divide and conquer. Maybe after you've looked at sheets, hand them to somebody else, but start harvesting. All right, time's up. Any observations just from that brief? You didn't get a lot of time to look at stuff, but any discoveries, observations, thoughts that anybody wants to share before we jump to the next piece?
I noticed while I was going through the biases, I was biased to pick the biases that I was already familiar with.
You were like looking for ones.
Yeah, I was like, it was just the ones I wanted to write down were the ones I already had heard of or had some exposure to.
Yeah. Anybody else? Any other observations just from that activity? I've never done this activity before. I just am curious. Any observations or yeah?
Some seem more universal, and others seem much more like perspectival.
Yeah, very
specific.
Yeah. Any other observations?
This is probably a bias, but like identifying with the law, but not necessarily wanting to admit to it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, look up the actor-observer bias, because I learned that, like, I do that all the time. And now forget that I ever said that, please. But it's a strange one, and I felt that too. Like, there were some that I was just like, oh, do I have to tell Netta about this one? Any other observations?
I've noticed that a lot of these biases are based around making decisions that are not rational or optimal, but then the trade-off is that when you have this bias, you actually have better emotional outcomes and or less energy use.
Yeah, so it could be, it's not necessarily optimized for rationality. It might be optimized for something else, like how you feel.
Exactly.
It turns out like entrepreneurs need to pretty much have an optimism bias because the likelihood of a startup succeeding is very infinitesimal. And so, how do you wake up every morning? Well, you better believe that it might happen, and that might have been a really good thing. It turns out people that are optimistic, there's some interesting studies about them living slightly longer, and if you got like mauled by a tiger and you hid in a bush and you survived, being optimistic about it turned out to be a trait you could pass on, maybe, who knows. So yeah, it's an interesting thing that it's not about necessarily rational in maybe the way we'd like to agree that we're rational, yeah. And that's that bounded rationality that we talked about from Herb Simon. Any last observation before we go to the next step? Idea, thought? Okay, so now I want you to discuss at the table the ones you came up with, and I want you to do what's called affinity diagramming. Does anybody know what affinity diagramming is? What is it? You just group like things that they like each other, so put them together. So maybe Mary, you'll say, there are 2 or 3 that I want to tell everybody else about, and you'll explain them, and then someone else at your table might go, oh yeah, no, I found one that I think is related to that. Or maybe I think that's an opposite effect. And I want you to just, as a team now, talk about these, and sort of bonus points if you draw some verb between them. So think of these concepts as nouns, and you're now going to draw the relationship. So here's an example. Right here. The fading affect bias is that bad memories fade fast. It's number 11. I think it relates to rosy retroflexion, which is that the boss doesn't want to talk about things except for the good news from the past project and the team. So I think 11 may feed 35 and be a way of us ignoring uncomfortable facts in past projects. You know, the post-mortem, why do we always keep going over budget? And it's because we don't really want to talk about what happens in the budget, because we don't want to talk about those 24-hour days. You know, and we kind of do that. So I wondered if they're related. So as a team, we might put 2 together. The continued influence effect, we talked about that. The Zeigarnik effect. That one was really interesting. Like if you stop a task halfway through, an incomplete task, you remember better. So I started thinking, whoa, like this guy couldn't ride his bike, but maybe the fact that he stopped every day, instead of actually trying for like 8 hours a day, but he actually tried a little bit, maybe that actually helped him. Because the incomplete tasks you learn better. You remember better. I don't know, but it made me kind of think about there might be something. So I might draw an arrow between these and say, could this, just write a sentence, help that? You know, from a learning standpoint. Now this one is the decoy effect, which is when you have like 3 choices. The third choice is really a decoy, and you pick one of the other ones.
And I think that's totally different, so I move it over here because it's not related. So that's what an affinity diagram is, like clustering things that are somehow related. And I just want you to all do that as a group, each group table of 4. Just discuss and do that. You've got about 15 minutes.
Even if you think you're right, you don't think that way. You can get it right a lot of the time.
That's validating.
Therefore, and I believe that I don't look for the ones that people are going into. No, these are all us. These are all us.
All right, so now we're going to do last activity. And this was, again, this is something that my intern had us do last year because we were saying, wow, to have a cognitive protection agency, first understanding them, like sensing the bad things that might happen, the bad stuff in our waterways, and trying to detect and getting smart about the science about it was kind of a metaphor for that. But how would we actually do something about it? How would we protect our cognition? How would we actually look at this? I was talking to Joshua, and he was saying it's a little bit overwhelming, like 190, and I guarantee those aren't all of them, and probably some of them are wrong. There was a recent study in behavioral science that looked at the most important studies from 2015, from 2010 to 2015 in the social sciences. And a group of people got together with a lot of funding. They went and talked to the original scientists who did the studies. They recruited 5 times as many people. They put the entire protocol together, and they weren't able to replicate 40%. Because it turns out people are hard, it's complicated, and a lot of the people who get tested for these studies over the history have been Western, civilized undergraduates that were bored, that were recruited for something. They would be classified as weird if you were looking at the population of 7 billion people or 8 billion people. That's a very small subset of the 8 billion people. So we might actually have just been fooled by numbers. There might have been some attribution errors, there might have been some other things. So there's a lot of work to do, and it could be overwhelming. What I take hope in is that I started asking the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral and Social Sciences, a group that's been going since the 1950s, modeled on the Center for Advanced Studies in Physics. It's got a retreat down the road from Stanford, and it's been running continuously. I said, is there like a model of how these fit together? Because it looks like this one has this guy's name on it, and this one has this thing on it, but has anyone actually looked at the model? And they were like, we don't know. That's a good question, because each one has been done with a different rigor at a different time by a different group. And a model is a way that we try to take a lot of complexity and see something, some underlying pattern to it so that we don't get overwhelmed. It's a way we can tame complexity, we find the architecture hidden underneath it. And for more to understand about that, I'd recommend, has anyone read the book Flatland? What was Flatland? Do you remember?
It's one-dimensional and two-dimensional
creatures, yeah. So it was written in like the 1920s, but I don't have it. And it posits a world of two-dimensional, one-dimensional, two-dimensional things. So like a line creature coming at you looks like a point until it turns sideways, and then it looks like an infinite thing. And an army figure was a triangle because they were sharp. They could poke holes, and when it came at you, you'd see like a point here and 2 points here and a fade. And the royalty were like perfect circles, just beautiful fade like this. And one day, 3 royal figures showed up out of nowhere, and they started almost communicating telepathically and dancing in this wild dance. And sometimes they looked like they were rushing towards people and disappearing, like they were growing up really fast. And the entire society couldn't understand what happened. And it turns out a 3-legged table had been set down on top of Flatland. And so the model, they couldn't have a model of the 3-dimensional world in their head. So to them it looked like 3 separate phenomena. But really, it was really just this thing was being moved around and being tipped and stuff. So that's what a model can bring to us. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think we have what would be called a parametric model of how our brain works. And we might never get there, because it's hard. But I take hope in that I think people actually for generations have been coming up with hacks. Whether it's meditation, whether it's yoga, whether it's design methods, whether it's improvisation, whether it's like musical, improvisation and play. People have come up with ways of getting over this. We've built amazing things. We've gone to other planets and things. So I think we've actually come up with something, and that's what we're going to talk about now, is how could we harvest, after we detect it, how could we match it to a way to actually tune that bias? And I say tune because we might want to actually amplify bias sometimes, not just cancel it. And I'll talk about that. So, part 2. Okay, I mentioned the Cognitive Protection Agency, but maybe we could start with like, not an EPA for cognition, but maybe an FDA for cognition. So what might that look like if Governor Newsom said, you know, and I would put a geofence around California, just like there's a sort of cyber wall around China, and anybody who uses any mobile device and wants to talk to my citizens, I have a Bill of Rights to protect cognition. And I require you to actually show an FDA label when you turn on Google. And the FDA label might look like this, you know. If you're using this for about an hour, it's going to steal about 230 cogitates. I just made that up. 1 hour is what we're looking at, about 8 servings a month for whatever you're doing. How much comprehension is it stealing? How much decision making? Can you even make an ethical decision after this? It turns out, how many people have heard of Kahneman and Tversky?
Yeah.
Who are they?
Say that word again.
Kahneman and Tversky.
Prospect.
Who are they?
You hear about
Psychologists, the behavioral economics, basically.
They kind of created that, yeah.
And the Undoing Project.
Thinking fast and slow.
Thinking Fast and Slow is a great book. A really wonderful, sort of high-level treatise on this called The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis. He kept wondering why, after he did Moneyball and all the rest, how come nobody ever makes better rational decisions? And everyone kept saying, well, if you knew Kahneman and Tversky, blah, blah, blah. And he was like, who are these guys? And he went and researched it and wrote The Undoing Project, which is a beautiful book. Well, they were able to demonstrate with a deck of cards destroying your ethical decision-making ability in about 10 minutes. So imagine you wake up in the morning and you're given an ethical dilemma, like there's a train rushing down the track and the brakes have stopped and they don't work and it's running towards this giant station with 500 people. But luckily we've tied a person to one of the other tracks, and if you just pull this lever, you'll only kill one person. Which one do you do? And they would do that kind of an ethical dilemma, and they test people in the morning, a lot of cognitive capacity, and then they would have people look at a deck of cards, and they would say, just look at the card and add 3. So add 3, like I would say Zorg. It's a 5 of diamonds. What would you say?
Any diamonds.
If I said King of Hearts, just add 3. Anybody want to help?
3 of us.
3. Oh, so you looped around. Okay, so a 7 of diamonds. Okay, so if we did this for about 10 minutes, and then I gave you the same ethical challenge, you'd kill all the people. And you won't have that back until tomorrow morning. And I'll let you read the book about this to find out more. But it just turns out that they've consumed so much of the slow thinking processing stuff, which requires rationality, math, and things like that, that it goes to sleep. And the fast moving one, the lizard, goes, I don't know, let me check with this guy, shakes the other one and says, wake up, this is one of your decisions. The lizard's job is to say, I gotta keep us alive, kill the people, I don't know. He's not waking up. And the lizard doesn't consume a lot of sugar, doesn't consume a lot of energy, so it keeps us alive. And that's what the premise of thinking fast and slow is, one part of it. Okay, so, you know, it might even say slippery slope alert. You're actually being habituated to short attention spans, and we've created a slippery slope towards bad behavior. So that was the idea. And the question was, instead of sort of amplifying our biases with bad behavior and bad design patterns and dumping all of our beautiful cognitive stuff into Superfund sites, what if instead we actually sort of grew our capacity? What if we could actually build ethical capacity? What if we could build rationality or curiosity through some kind of exercise? What if we could actually maybe use that comprehension to learn something new, to grow our gas tank in this metaphor? And just like a Prius or a self-driving, a hybrid car, maybe in the act of trying to like use that capacity, we canceled some of the biases, and maybe just like you have to use a lot of energy to accelerate fast, when you hit the brake, it spins up the flywheel and recharges the brain. So what if we could do something a little different? What if we could kind of have Bose noise canceling, but for cognitive biases? So that was the idea. Does anybody know how Bose noise canceling works? How does it work?
They produce
got a little microphone, pays attention fast, it's got a really fast chip that's faster than sound, and it hears like a jackhammer, and then it generates the opposite, and suddenly you hear nothing. So it cancels it, just with physics. But it actually amplifies people's voices, because that has a different amplitude and a different frequency. So it acts as a dynamic noise canceling system. Could we do that with all this noise that we have around us, the stuff begging for our attention? So that was the theory. I want to give you an example of a hack we came up with as an example. And then I want the whole group here to try and come up with some hacks. So it turns out at Maya, our cognitive scientists studied how much of the Simon scissors we could offload to the physical environment. And it turns out you can remember about 7 plus or minus 2 things, or about a 2.5 second loop in Western language of facts and numbers and stuff. So you can kind of keep like a 7-digit phone number in your head, long enough so you can go write it down. But while you can only remember 7 plus or minus 2 things in short-term memory, you can remember 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000 things in physical space. The space remembers for you. If you learn, you have to invest in it. You have to learn how to draw blobs for nouns and arrows for verbs, a little bit like what you were doing today. If you really invest in that, it probably takes about a month, you can remember 10,000 things in physical space. You can walk back into the same space. This is what my lab looks like. I've had customers come in 10 years later and go, hey, do you remember that iceberg we drew right here? And then wind back, because when it is what it means, and where it is what it is. It turns out that it's the way humans and squirrels index the world. So that's a trick, but it takes comprehension. You have to actually invest in it, but it could spin up a new flywheel and grow your capacity. And Adam Gazali, who's going to be actually the keynote at the event Joshua talked about, published a paper that showed at 70 years old, using kind of an algorithm and sensing, he was able to actually reboot 70-year-old brains. So they have the same power of paying attention and the same working memory as 22. And it was cover of Nature. So he's actually starting to prove some things and doing some really interesting stuff about how do we actually train something different. Okay, so remember these. I decided to try this out, and then I decided to try this out. We went and visited a designer. We said, hey, Aisha, you wrote a book called Design the Life You Love. You've designed $100 million programs for like Herman Miller. Your husband, Bibi, has designed cars for Nissan. What are the tricks you always use at the beginning of a project to cancel biases? And she said, oh, I use this really cool thing called deconstruction reconstruction. So like if they're designing a new soup for Campbell's soup, I say, let's explode this can of soup and figure out what it's made of, so that they don't just use their sort of, their own understanding of that. And so anyway, she walked us through that, we talked to some other people, and then we started actually trying to map these tricks that she'd come up with, design methods, to the biases. Like, what is she doing during deconstruction? What is she doing during reconstruction? Is she exploiting some of those biases? Is she amplifying some? Misunderstanding is a great one to amplify if you actually want to get new ideas. You give people not complete information and they just make stuff up. You confabulate. I ran an institute and started an institute a long time ago called Luma. We cataloged over 1,500 design methods over 100 years and looked at methods for looking, listening, discovering, abstraction laddering, etc. Could some of those match? You know, the act of doing contextual inquiry gets yourself out of your head and actually see what the real world looks like, not what a designer or an engineer thinks it looks like. Walking a mile in someone's shoes. This is somebody actually simulating having arthritis and low vision. Helps you have empathy for people that think differently than you. Doing rapid prototypes where you can hear aloud what people do might actually help you with things, or doing economic experiments like this might do it. So what I want you to do now, here's your challenge, last little experiment. I want you to all together talk about, does anybody have a hack that they've used to fix one of those clusters? So I'll give you an example.
You might only come up with one. You're going to write it on an orange post-it note now, and the whole team is just trying to figure out a hack. It could be any hack, but it could be a hack that you've done from your meditation that's helped you think differently, or wake up fresher, or do something. It could be some other trick you've come up with. It could be a design method, an improv method. It could be from any other part. Here's an example. The continued influence effect might, which is that kind of how can I learn how to ride a backward bike, might actually be able to take advantage of the Zeigarnik effect, which is that incomplete tasks actually are remembered better. And I thought those were related. I've run some experiments on some design methods called the creative matrix, where I put multiple teams together trying to come up with ideas, and I don't let them have a lot of time, and I stop it in the middle, and I say, time's up, and they all have to switch and hack each other. It's called the matrix matchup. And everyone's looking at the other people doing the math matrix, they're trying to finish faster, and they all end up learning how to actually do that activity in one session. And when I used to try to do it, I'd show pictures, I'd explain it, and then they'd go to try to do it, and they couldn't do it at all. But when I actually had them practice it a little bit and actually feel a little competitive thing, it worked really well. A typical evening in like 40 minutes would give you about 800 ideas, which was kind of nice. So it was a fascinating method. It came out of the Luma toolbox. So what I want you to do is, just what I did here. Maybe you saw something like the fading affect effect of rosy red reflection, and you've got a pre-mortem trick that you do so that the team doesn't ignore the hard parts. Write it down, stick it up, and see what you can come up with. I'm not going to give you a lot of time for this. I just want you to start now.
It's sort of the other shot. Not really separate.
What I'd love you to do is, does some team want to just talk about a hack they discovered? Any team want to just volunteer talking about it? Just one. Okay, can you grab your sheet, the whole sheet, just pick it up. Pick the whole big sheet up. And bring it on over here. We'll just set it right here. And come on up and tell us about it.
So we have some circles. For these ones here, like we have the endowment effect, where well, we spoke about that already, and then like overconfidence bias. And so he said that maybe a good way of counteracting that, or a hack for that, would be to like find a neutral reference. So like either like for whatever the like item is that you have, or like the skill that it is that you think you have, like maybe like look it up on Google and see like if folks are also like performing on that level, like how they're perceived or how that specific object is perceived, like from the internet as a whole versus like what you
just
think
you.
it should be.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
All right, anybody else? Any other team want to just share one hack? A hack or two. Anybody else? This is your chance. Anybody have a hack? Bring your sheet up. Not actually right here. Bring this up a little bit. There we go. So can you explain what happened? Just one of them, or what do you want to talk about?
So this was in regards to planning fallacy and the restraint bias, which was we tend to think that we are able to do something but can't, and then restraint bias is we think that we can restrain from like eating chocolate cake, but then we don't. And what I do is peer accountability, which is if I want to write for an hour a week, then I'll host an event so that people come and we write together for an hour a week.
It holds you accountable.
Yeah.
Perfect. I love it. Okay, everyone else, grab your sheets and just bring them over here so we can just put them all across this wall. And then if there's any last comment anybody wants to make, we'll do that. So come stick them up. You don't even have to talk about it if you don't want it. Just bring them up. Just put the next one here. Put the next one here. One like that. There. Go too high. Yeah. Bring it over here. Down over here. Secretly, I'm just doing this because the post-its will fall off if I try to take them. Bring it over here. Right here. Okay, anybody have a last comment about one of the ones they put up? And if you don't, it's okay. I'm going to take pictures of all these things and share them back with Netta because she said this was my task for tonight. They fall, they fall. It's the post-it note fallacy. I really appreciate everybody doing this tonight. Any last comments or any observations anyone wants to make? You burned out. Questions? Do you have a question?
Yeah. Regarding the bicycle thing, and if the guy had ridden his normal bike for a minute after the hour of writing that like, would it have taken him much longer to learn, just like kids take longer to learn language growing up if they're bilingual?
Oh, interesting. I have no idea, but see, that sounds like a fun experiment. Like now that we know that our mental model of how our pathways degrade and how we build new muscles, there could be all sorts of fun experiments to try to see how can we optimize those or how can we experiment with that. I was reminded of a bias. I read a book called How to Build a Curious Mind. Has anybody read that book? It's by the guy who worked with Ron Howard to actually do the movie How to Build a Beautiful Mind or A Beautiful Mind and the movie Apollo 13. And it's a book about how he turned curiosity into a habit every month since he was 23 years old. And that curiosity allowed him to make things like Apollo 13, 8 Mile, A Beautiful Mind, and other things, because he was just super curious about people. He would just try to find a way to have once a month a meeting of people outside of Hollywood so that he could learn. He met with Jonas Salk, and he threw up all over Jonas Salk, sadly, because he was a little sick that day and nervous. But he went through this process, and he learned a lot. And actually, I think it has a bunch of tricks in there that I'd love to play with for ourselves, for curiosity, because I'd love to build that. And he found a way to do that over his whole career. Brian Grazer. Any other comments or questions or thoughts?
Where can we find a copy of this great list?
I can give it to Josh or whatever. We can send it out to everybody. I'd love to, yeah.
Yeah, I'll mail it out to everybody who's here.
And that FDA kind of cognition picture, if you type in the Great Cognitive Depression, you can find it in an article that we published on Forbes recently. And it was about what would happen if complex decision-making collapsed. How would we get anything done that we need to get done? Any other questions or thoughts?
Was there something about machine learning tackling initiative? Like
Yeah.
remembering some buzzword from the event?
Correct. Well, I'll tell you a little sneak peek. So the question is, could we actually use sensors to actually start detecting enough signals of amplitude and frequency so that we could actually start seeing these things? Because a great facilitator actually gets, or a good team leader is like, hey, we should table that till tomorrow. Hey, I think I noticed that you guys haven't talked at all, and this loudmouth has talked the whole time. How do we help make sure that the loudmouth doesn't run the world? A great leader is good at that. They're detecting something. So the question is, could we have a machine learning system that could start detecting this stuff, and then could we have maybe another matching engine that actually looks at design methods and improv methods and cognitive science and behavioral economy and try to match them and say, hey, by the way, you might want to do this. Or Sandy Pentland at MIT built a table. And we know turn-taking in high-performing interdisciplinary teams matters. It builds things better. The table just glows towards the person who speaks the most in a meeting. So it's like an ambient awareness. It's not like, but it's what a good facilitator does. So that's the interesting question. And I might have even included something as kind of bonus. Imagine you have this is silly, an Alexa skill in a meeting, and a different kind of thing, not just a clock on the wall, but actually an aggregated cognition meter, like a fuel tank. And just like Bose, you could just detect things. So an example might be, we know that when you cross your arms like this, you're blocking a lot of things, and a good facilitator kind of notices that that's like, I'm protecting my core. It also sometimes means that you might not believe what the person's saying, or you don't want to actually listen. But if they're leaning in, sometimes that means I want to hear a little bit more. And I noticed that when I used to facilitate things, people would be like, wait, what are you talking about? We also know that a real big bias between men and women is that in meetings, often, and I'm not saying this for all men, will roll their eyes when women start talking. Indra Nooyi, who ran Pepsi for 73 successful quarters out of 75 quarters at Pepsi, she would offer the men eye drops every time they rolled their eyes. So we know that means contempt, rolling the eyes, or disbelief, or disdain. So could we just observe that? Could we observe other things? Could we observe that people are saying, you should do this, you should do this, you should do this, which sounds like authority bias, versus you could do this, why don't we try this? What about this? How might we do this? Which is a little more improvisational. Could we look at if interdisciplinary teams are not even talking the same language? Like the 5 blind men who try to describe an elephant. And we can see engineers keep saying one thing, but they're not even really talking about the thing the business person's saying. So could we just look at even lexical search on those things? Now, I don't know the answers to this. This is a provocation. But what might happen if we could actually start helping people that are maybe a little blind to this, or things that even Kahneman has said he can't actually detect? And what if we could actually use the IoT in the physical world to detect that? Now that could be powerful and dangerous too. So I leave it to the world to kind of try to think about what this might mean. I appreciate the question. I felt like it was really important to just do this first, but I'm going to be here for another 20 minutes or so if you want to learn more. And I'm continuing to publish sort of parts of the sequel to my book Trillions, which actually encodes all this stuff. So you can watch the skies. All right, time is out. It's 9:07. I think we have this room till 9:30. Feel free to just hang out and talk to your new friends and old friends. Thanks a lot, everybody.